All these things were now starting to finally come together. And the person that puts it together during this time period is Bayard Rustin. Another one who was completely forgotten in our history, iced out, marginalized because he was openly gay. Rustin's activism actually dates back to the 1930s, a huge career of activism. But for Rustin, he was involved in a peace movement that was dominated mostly by white middle-class pacifists, and he was much more radical than them, and had to fight racism within these organizations. And so, in the late 1950s, two big things are happening that connect these issues. One is Ghana's independence under Kwame Nkrumah. The second, the French government, in the middle of being overthrown in Algeria, decide they want to be a world power and announce they're going to test their first nuclear weapon. Where? In Africa, in the Sahara. So Rustin puts together a team of US, British, and African activists working with Nkrumah, because for the people in Ghana, they were so worried about the nuclear fallout and what it would do to the cocoa industry. And their goal was to try to stop the French test. And Rustin goes to Africa, and not everybody wanted him to go. Philip Randolph was writing letters saying, you need to be back here. You need to be working on the civil rights movement. We need to work on the primaries and John Kennedy and so on and so forth. And Rustin's writing back saying, don't you understand, this is the most important thing I could be doing. Don't you see how these things are all related? I have to be here. And they try several times, physically putting their bodies on the line to try to stop the French test. And sadly they don't, and the French finally detonate their first nuclear weapon. But I would argue he was successful, because after this, the continent exploded in protests against the bomb. Nkrumah had follow-up conferences and events to try to highlight this issue. And there was such public pressure that eventually the French did abandon their nuclear testing. And of course, I can't talk to you about black anti-nuclear activism without discussing Dr. King. You know, for Dr. King, we're starting more and more to look at the radical side of Dr. King that is, again, so often ignored. That last year of his life, right, where he spoke out against capitalism and militarism, combined it with racism. But again, the general consensus is that King doesn't really become radical, or King doesn't speak out on U.S. foreign policy until April 4th, 1967, exactly a year to the day he died, with his Beyond Vietnam speech, in which he called the United States, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. But if you study the nuclear issue, you will see that actually he was speaking out about this issue a decade earlier in 1957. In 1957, he made his first public comments in Ebony magazine saying unequivocally he thought we should ban nuclear weapons. He consistently spoke at churches, black schools, colleges, and universities, to the church, to black pastors, calling nuclear weapons genocidal, suicidal. Saying, what does it matter if we're integrating lunch counters and then not being concerned about the world in which we're trying to integrate? It's absurd to fight for social justice if we're all dead from nuclear war afterwards. It doesn't make any sense. He pushed Kennedy for a nuclear test ban. And where was Dr. King learning all of this? From his wife, of course. Coretta Scott King was a long-seasoned activist dating back to her days at Antioch College. She had worked in groups like Women's Strike for Peace and Women's International League of Peace and Freedom. And she was not alone. There were a bevy of black women who were working inside these organizations. The problem was, just like for Rustin, these black women were facing racism inside the organizations. There was a meeting in Detroit with Women's Strike for Peace, in which black women wanted to carry signs that said desegregation or disintegration. And the white organizers said, no, we don't want to combine the issue of race with the bomb. And it was often Coretta who had to play peacemaker and had to try to broker deals through this. Lorraine Hansberry, who we all know from A Raisin in the Sun, was a militant, feminist, anti-nuclear activist. She famously went into a movie theater and saw a film on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and came out and yelled in the streets, no more Hiroshimas, not now, not ever. And the last play that she ever wrote was actually about a nuclear holocaust and what happens to the two survivors. Throughout the Vietnam War, we see this because, again, we threatened to use nuclear weapons in Vietnam multiple times, again, on non-white peoples. Even if you read the executive mandate number 1 of the Black Panther Party, you will see that when they talk about their struggle, they also talk about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I asked Bobby Seale, was that a conscious decision? He said, of course it was. We always looked at ourselves in an international manner. And indeed, Kathleen Cleaver, Eldridge were invited to speak in Hiroshima, and there was that connection as well. And in the 1970s, when so many people were physically exhausted, mentally exhausted from the Vietnam War and the Black freedom struggle, this issue remained. You know, in 1976, there was what was called the Continental Walk for Nuclear Disarmament. People were going to come from all different corners of the country, meet in Washington, D.C. And for many, this was just simply a nonviolent act, a march, no big deal. Except if you were black and you were living in the South and you were partaking in this. Because the police made it clear they weren't going to help them. So on their march, they were beaten. If somebody took them in and let them stay in their homes on the way, their houses were vandalized. So there were real consequences for them. If we look at Jimmy Carter, who was the person in his administration pushing him to not further nuclear arms race? Andy Young, his UN ambassador, was of course Dr. King's right-hand man. It was Andy Young who pressured President Carter to not build a neutron bomb. It was Andy Young who wanted to make sure that the South African government, the white apartheid government, gave up the nuclear weapons program, which they were building with the help from Israel. And they finally gave it up only when they knew Nelson Mandela was going to take power because they didn't want the bomb in, quote, black hands, even though Mandela would have dismantled it anyways because he hated nuclear weapons. And this was really all culminating into the 1980s when we had the largest anti-nuclear march in our history. When Ronald Reagan comes into power, it ignited this movement even more. Because Ronald Reagan came in and announced that he was going to balloon the defense budget by $180 million, and he was going to slash social programs by $140 million. He was going to expand our nuclear arsenal. And so a new campaign started called Bombs Over Babies, in which people started saying they were going to look at how they could take that money out of nuclear weapons and put it into economically depressed areas. You know, when I was writing this book, and I was writing for Huffington Post, I received a phone call from a gentleman in Washington, D.C., where I live, and he said, we need to meet. I said, okay. His name was Greg Johnson, he's in the book, and him and his wife, he was a librarian at Georgetown, African-American man, his wife, and he said, we were so interested in this issue in the 1980s. But every time we went to peace groups, every time we went to anti-nuclear groups, they said, there's not enough support in your community. And we could never get anybody in our community to talk about it. So they said, the hell with it, we'll make our own organization. And with one flyer and a rotary phone, they started the group Blacks Against Nukes. Grew to multiple chapters. Were featured in Essence and Ebony and Jet Magazine. Were asked to travel to Hiroshima and speak to delegations there. Ordinary citizens doing extraordinary things. And I'm so glad that we now have the resurgence of a politically and socially conscious athlete. You know, I was down in Florida and I taught in Sanford, which is the area where Trayvon Martin was murdered. I was actually teaching the death of Emmett Till when Trayvon Martin's 911 tapes came out. But it was so refreshing to see LeBron James throw his hoodie up when he was playing in Miami before anybody had to tell him, any publicist had to tell him to do so. Seeing athletes now wearing I Can't Breathe t-shirts. Serena Williams, which she's been doing for Black Lives Matter. We're seeing that again. A throwback to Muhammad Ali and John Carlos and Tommy Smith. The complete opposite of those like Michael Jordan. But there was another group in the 1980s that was just like this. They were called Athletes United for Peace. Professional football players, basketball players, baseball, that were working with Soviet athletes and that were working to bring peace and nuclear disarmament in this country. And then, of course, you had the June 12th, 1982 march right here in New York City. in which over 1 million people got together to march against nuclear weapons, the largest march we've ever had. What a lot of people don't know, though, is when that march was being formed and organized, the lead organizers did not want there to be any issues of race involved. And so, under the leadership of the amazing, the great Reverend Herbert Daughtry, who is ill right now and I know is going to get better and is going to be with us for another 20, 30 years to come, great man that he is, he put together what is known as the Black United Front, saying that we have to combine these issues of race and nuclear disarmament. And with help from people like Ossie Davis and Ruby Dee and Chaka Khan and Toni Morrison and so many more, they merged together. 50% of the leadership that day was black, marching through Bed-Stuy, marching through Harlem. And there was also a young reporter covering that event, Barack Obama. You know, Obama was the hardest part for me to write about this book. I knew I was going to have to address it, looking at the subject matter. But as a historian, the worst thing that I can do is to predict and then be wrong.